The defining feature of the modern era is not a single war, invention, or disaster, but a pervasive sense of unease shared by people across borders, cultures, and political systems, a feeling that the world is becoming harder to understand, harder to trust, and harder to predict, because public concern today is no longer driven by isolated events, but by the accumulation of pressures that shape how societies perceive reality itself, and surveys conducted around the world reveal striking similarities in what people fear most: misinformation, economic uncertainty, environmental instability, and the erosion of trust in governance, forces that together are reshaping public perception and quietly destabilizing the foundations of social cohesion. At the center of this shift lies a crisis of information. As misinformation has evolved from a fringe problem into a defining feature of the global landscape, fueled by digital platforms that reward speed, emotion, and engagement over accuracy, allowing false or misleading narratives to spread faster than verification or correction ever could. And in this environment, truth becomes fragmented, contested, and politicized, leaving individuals overwhelmed by competing claims and uncertain whom to believe. As traditional gatekeepers of information lose authority and new voices, both genuine and manipulative, rise to fill the vacuum. This erosion of shared reality has profound consequences because societies depend on a basic agreement about facts to function, and when that agreement breaks down, trust dissolves not only between citizens and institutions, but between neighbors, communities, and even families, as public discourse hardens into opposing camps that interpret the same events in radically different ways, reinforcing polarization and making compromise increasingly difficult, and turning disagreement into suspicion, and suspicion into hostility. Economic uncertainty further deepens this sense of instability as millions of people navigate a world where the promise of steady progress feels increasingly fragile, with rising living costs, housing shortages, debt, job insecurity, and the rapid transformation of labor markets driven by automation and globalization, creating the perception that the future offers fewer guarantees than the past, particularly for younger generations who face delayed independence, stagnant wages, and the pressure to adapt constantly just to maintain their footing. While economic growth continues in many regions, the benefits are unevenly distributed, reinforcing inequality and feeding the belief that systems are structured to favor a small minority at the expense of the majority. And when people feel economically vulnerable, their tolerance for uncertainty diminishes, making them more susceptible to narratives that promise stability, protection, or simple explanations for complex problems, a pattern that has repeated throughout history during periods of economic stress. Overlaying these pressures is the growing weight of environmental concern as climate change moves from abstract projections to lived experience, reshaping landscapes and livelihoods through extreme weather, rising seas, droughts, and heat waves that disrupt daily life and challenge the assumption that the natural world is stable and predictable. And as these events multiply, they reinforce the sense that humanity is losing control over the systems that sustain life, intensifying anxiety about long-term survival and intergenerational responsibility. Environmental instability also acts as a threat multiplier, exacerbating existing social and economic vulnerabilities by straining resources, driving migration, and increasing competition over water, food, and land, particularly in regions already facing political or economic fragility, creating conditions where local crises can escalate into regional or global challenges, reinforcing the perception that no nation is insulated from the consequences of planetary change. Beneath these visible pressures lies a deeper erosion of trust in governance, as citizens across political systems express growing skepticism about the ability of institutions to respond effectively to fast-moving, interconnected crises, whether those institutions are democratic or authoritarian, national or international. And this skepticism is fueled not only by policy failures, but by perceptions of corruption, inefficiency, and detachment from everyday realities, widening the gap between decision-makers and the populations they serve. When trust in governance declines, political polarization intensifies as voters disengage from traditional parties, gravitate toward extremes, or withdraw from participation altogether, believing that their voices no longer matter, and this disengagement weakens democratic accountability, creating a feedback loop where ineffective governance further erodes trust, and eroded trust makes effective governance even harder to achieve, leaving societies more vulnerable to instability and manipulation. Technology plays a central role in amplifying these dynamics, acting simultaneously as a tool for empowerment and a catalyst for division. As digital platforms connect billions of people while fragmenting public discourse into algorithm-driven echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs and isolate dissenting perspectives. And as artificial intelligence increasingly shapes what information people see, consume, and trust, questions about transparency, accountability, and control become more urgent, particularly when automated systems influence public opinion without clear oversight or public understanding. The psychological impact of living in this environment is becoming increasingly visible as stress, anxiety, and a sense of helplessness rise across populations, reflecting the strain of constant exposure to crisis narratives and the feeling that events are unfolding beyond individual or collective control. And for many, especially younger generations, this manifests as a persistent uncertainty about the future, shaped by economic instability, climate anxiety, and the perception that global systems are reaching their limits. Despite the gravity of these challenges, history suggests that moments of heightened public concern often precede periods of transformation when societies are forced to confront uncomfortable truths and reassess long-standing assumptions. And while fear can drive division, it can also motivate reform, innovation, and renewed efforts to rebuild trust, provided there is leadership capable of acknowledging complexity without exploiting it, and of articulating a shared vision that restores confidence without denying reality. Addressing the forces shaping global perceptions requires more than reactive policy or surface-level fixes, because misinformation, economic insecurity, environmental instability, and institutional distrust are interconnected, reinforcing one another in ways that demand coordinated, long-term responses, from strengthening media literacy and transparency to rebuilding economic inclusion, investing in climate resilience, and restoring the legitimacy of governance through accountability and responsiveness. Trust, once lost, cannot be rebuilt overnight, but it can be restored through consistent action that aligns words with outcomes, demonstrating that institutions are capable of learning, adapting, and acting in the public interest, even amid uncertainty, and that complexity does not have to lead to paralysis or division. Ultimately, the story of public concern in the modern world is not just a story of fear, but of awareness, a recognition that humanity is deeply interconnected, that crises do not exist in isolation, and that perceptions shape reality as powerfully as events themselves, because how societies interpret uncertainty will determine whether it becomes a force for fragmentation or a catalyst for cooperation. The choices made in this era by governments, institutions, and individuals alike will shape not only policies and markets, but the collective psychology of a generation, determining whether global awareness leads to cynicism and withdrawal or to a renewed commitment to shared responsibility in an increasingly complex world. Because while uncertainty may be unavoidable, the response to it remains a matter of choice. And in that choice lies the possibility of resilience rather than division, and stability built not on illusion, but on trust, rebuilt through action.